The Third Reich was the embodiment of all the evils of the 20th century, committing some of the most brutal crimes ever recorded. But its malice was not only focused on eliminating those considered inferior, but also on sexually enslaving thousands of women throughout Europe. In this new military history video, we are going to learn about the infamous military brothels established by the Third Reich, what life was like for the women who were prisoners there, and what their fate was once they were released. Get ready to know one of the toughest and most unpleasant episodes of World War II. But before continuing, let me tell you that we are now part of Zarta, the platform that gives creators the chance to upload special content or in advance so that you can enjoy it by paying only 10 cents for any video you prefer. In fact, our next release on the suffering of women who fell into the hands of the Nazis is already available on Zarta, and you can watch it right away. Don't miss it! It's a very interesting documentary with shocking information. We're waiting for you at Zarta.com to travel back in time. And now, let's go on with today's video. Within months of World War II, German generals realized that it was impossible to prevent their soldiers from having sexual relations. Instead of banning them completely, they decided to control and systematize them, as is traditional German rigidity. Thus it was that the German army established a huge network of military brothels throughout the occupied territories. During the conflict, the Germans operated some 500 military brothels at strategic points. For example, in Paris there were about 19 only on the outskirts of the city. This is how, throughout the war, between 34,000 and 50,000 young people were forced into prostitution. Some historians claim that the number of Nazi sex slaves was much higher. The man behind the organization of the military brothels was Reinhard Heydrich. He was one of the highest-ranking officers within the SS, and was one of the main architects of the Holocaust. His evil plans were not limited to the murder of hundreds of thousands of people, but also to the imprisonment of women to satisfy the needs of his troops. March 16, 1940 was the day the existence of state-controlled brothels was legally established by the Third Reich, beginning one of the darkest facets of World War II. German commanders had many reasons for setting up this prostitution ring. The first was the great threat of venereal diseases such as gonorrhea or syphilis among the soldiers. Within this system, doctors could examine captive women in military brothels to prevent an epidemic. In addition, the commanders established strict policies regarding the use of prophylactics to avoid infections and pregnancies. The second reason was the fear of female spies. During World War II, the Germans noticed that when soldiers socialized with local women, resistance attacks were more effective and deadly. Any attractive woman was suspected of being a local spy, and it was because of that paranoia that they chose to establish their gruesome world of controlled prostitution at gunpoint. The third reason was the obsessive homophobia within Nazi ideology. In the minds of the commanders of the Third Reich, the lack of sexual relations with women would lead their troops to homosexual practices that they considered unnatural. If the soldiers had access to prostitution, they would avoid any kind of alleged perversion. Like all aspects of German life during the Third Reich, military brothels were rigidly organized, following a factory logic that sought to maximize the operability of the place at the cost of the prisoner's health. The young women began their day at 6 in the morning with a medical checkup to verify that they did not have sexually transmitted diseases. The doctors checked the prisoners between 1 and 3 times a week. Between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, the young women prepared for the workday. Between 2 p.m. and 8:30 p.m., they had to serve as the sex slaves of any German soldiers and officers who visited the facility. Women often received tattoos that permanently marked them as prostitutes along with an identifying number. To prevent pregnancies, each slave was sterilized, and German doctors generally did not use anesthesia. If a slave contracted a sexually transmitted disease or some other type of illness, she was transported to a special place for treatment, which was usually a shot to the head. Any complaint from the German soldiers was also grounds for firing squad, so the women tried to be as docile and receptive as possible to the soldiers' requests. German generals recommended a weekly visit to brothels to prevent any type of excess or deviation in their soldiers. Each German had a 15-minute visit, and each visit cost 3 marks, which is about $20 at current exchange rates. The soldiers had to follow a fairly strict procedure. It's no joke that Nazis loved order, even to commit heinous crimes. First, the German soldier had to complete a special questionnaire. Once completed, he received a condom and a bactericide to clean himself. As we told you, having sex without a prophylactic was not allowed, but even so, the soldiers used to offer large sums of money for women to agree to have sex without protection. Some of the women who lived in military brothels chose that life over being sent to concentration camps. It was known that in these facilities the destination was death by forced labor or direct extermination. There really wasn't much of a choice between becoming sex slaves or receiving a slow and painful death sentence. The network of brothels grew during the 1940s, and by the end of that year, the Germans already had hundreds of facilities throughout the occupied territory. The problem was procuring prostitutes. The brutality of war claimed too many lives, and many local women would rather die fighting than succumb to slavery to the enemy. The Nazi solution to the lack of prostitutes was to resort to slavery. Every time they managed to capture a woman, her destination was one of the military brothels. German forces frequently carried out raids on small defenseless towns to kidnap young people and adolescents between the ages of 15 and 30. That is why the women of Europe were afraid to walk the streets. The danger of being captured by the German police was real, and the fate in many cases was worse than death. As the war progressed, this practice became more difficult, and the Germans began to set their sights on the women prisoners inside the concentration camps. For example, the Ravensbrück camp was infamous for becoming a great source of women for that state-run prostitution ring. Nearly 5,000 women were selected for these facilities. Many of them, knowing the kind of fate that awaited them, chose to take their own lives. You may be wondering how this coexisted with the racist ideology of the Third Reich. After all, weren't they women of an inferior race that had to be exterminated? Well, like almost all the ideological aspects of Nazism, the rigidity of its application depended on the context and the convenience of the German government. The German soldiers did not care if the women in the brothels were Aryan or Semitic, if they were from Berlin or from a Romanian village. What mattered to them was that they were attractive and that they could not refuse. According to his reasoning, having sex in a brothel with a person of an inferior race was not dangerous for the master plan, since it did not imply any type of socialization or fraternization. The few women who survived this hell had to endure the shame of being branded in their hometowns as bad women for having related to Germans, forgetting that they were prisoners of the Third Reich. In some cases, the punishment for associating with Germans was firing squad. That is why many victims claimed that their punishment was to work on plantations or forced labor camps, not in the infamous brothels of Nazi Germany. This is how we come to the end of this video. If you want to continue learning about the most important events in history, we recommend you subscribe and activate notifications to be aware of our news. We'll meet again in the next episode of Military History.